La Cambre Quarantaine, France. The 2nd day of July, 1944. By this date, more than 100,000 patients had passed through United States Army hospitals in the European theater of operations. Among them were thousands of German prisoners of war. Under the Geneva Convention of 1929, the detaining power was obligated to provide medical care free of charge, and equivalent to that afforded its own troops. The United States Army Nurse Corps expanded from fewer than 7,000 before the war to roughly 59,000 by 1945, staffed field and evacuation hospitals where German prisoners were triaged, transfused, operated on, and nursed under the same protocols as American soldiers. Signal Corps photographs from Normandy show prisoner litters entering aid stations. Post-operative ward logs record German patients receiving standardized nursing care. The surprise noted in inspections and memoirs was not survival alone, but the measured professional attitude behind it. What aligned policy, manpower, and logistics to make equal treatment a theater-wide reality? Washington, District of Columbia. The 27th day of July, 1929. In a War Department office, a staff officer placed the newly ratified Geneva Convention on prisoners of war onto a briefing binder for the Surgeon General's review. Article 10 was clear. Medical attention must be provided free of charge. Article 14 specified that every camp shall have an infirmary where prisoners of war may receive every kind of attention they may require. The detaining power's obligation was unambiguous, treatment equivalent to that afforded the troops of the detaining power. Many German soldiers, indoctrinated by years of propaganda, expected reprisals when captured. They had been told that American forces would deny medical care, that wounds would fester untreated, that prison hospitals were merely holding pens for the dying. The reality, codified in Washington more than a decade before the war began, told a different story. By 1942, the United States Army Medical Department had developed a mature doctrine of battlefield evacuation. The chain was methodical: battalion aid station, collecting point, clearing station, field hospital, evacuation hospital, and finally general hospital in the rear. At each stage, standardized procedures governed triage, resuscitation with plasma, administration of whole blood, surgical intervention, and post-operative nursing care. The system was designed for volume and speed, not sentiment. Major General Norman T. Kirk served as Surgeon General of the United States Army. Brigadier General Albert W. Kenner held the position of Supreme Headquarters Allied Expeditionary Force Chief Medical Officer. Major General Paul R. Hawley commanded as European Theater of Operations United States Army Chief Surgeon. Colonel Florence A. Blanchfield superintended the Army Nurse Corps. These were not theorists. They administered a system that would process hundreds of thousands of casualties across multiple theaters. The Army Nurse Corps numbered fewer than 7,000 members before the war. By 1945, that figure had grown nearly ninefold to approximately 59,000. In January of 1945, manpower shortages became severe enough that the War Department considered a near-draft proposal for nurses. The scale of expansion reflected not only American casualties, but also the legal and doctrinal commitment to treat all patients according to medical need. Standing operating procedures specified plasma sets, whole blood protocols, anesthesia standards, antibiotic administration schedules, wound dressings, and post-operative observation. Nurses staffed surgical wards, shock wards, and convalescent sections. The technology was standardized. The organization was repeatable. The International Committee of the Red Cross maintained a database of convention obligations and inspected compliance. The rule had been written in 1929, but it became auditable practice only when the nurse force multiplied in 1944 and 45. International law and Army Medical Department doctrine together created a legal and procedural foundation. The obligation was on paper. The test would come in the field. Normandy, France, the 6th day of June through the 31st day of July, 1944. A clearing station clerk stacked triage tags on a field desk as litters arrived under military police guard. Among the incoming wounded were German prisoners. Some were barely conscious. Others watched American medics with wary eyes, expecting the worst. German soldiers had been told stories. They anticipated neglect, delayed treatment, perhaps worse. Theater records tell a different story. Prisoner litters entered the same evacuation chain as United States wounded. Triage was conducted by medical urgency. Plasma was administered according to shock protocol. Surgical priority was determined by wound severity and physiological status, not by the uniform a man had worn hours earlier. First United States Army medical groups operated evacuation hospitals attached to 5th and 7th Corps. Army Nurse Corps surgical sections staffed operating rooms and post-operative wards. The procedures were identical. Penicillin schedules did not distinguish nationality. Shock ward observation charts tracked pulse, blood pressure, and urine output, without reference to allegiance. Operating room time-to-knife targets applied universally. A summary of theater standing operating procedures, preserved in medical archives, stated the principle plainly: patients will be treated according to medical urgency without regard to nationality. Custody is a separate function. Military police handled security, medical officers handled medicine. The functions were separated by design. By early July, European theater of operations admissions exceeded 100,000. Among them were steady intakes of prisoner patients to evacuation hospitals. Severe cases were evacuated to the United Kingdom by landing ship, tank, or air transport. The same aircraft and ships carried American and German wounded on the same manifests, segregated by guard detail, but processed through identical medical channels. Standardized evacuation protocols and adequate nurse staffing preserved throughput. The system absorbed prisoner cases without degrading care for American soldiers. Whole blood was cross-matched. Anesthesia was administered by trained personnel. Post-operative nursing followed written orders. Nationality appeared only in administrative blocks on charts, not in clinical instructions. Within 6 weeks of the Normandy landings, a pattern emerged. Survival correlated with time from wounding to definitive surgery. Availability of blood products and nurse-to-patient ratios on post-operative wards. It did not correlate with the flag under which a man had fought. Medical archives document this in admissions logs, surgical case summaries, and evacuation manifests. The expectation had been chaos, perhaps punitive withholding. The record shows regulated processing. Theater medical officers reported that the limiting factors were beds, surgical teams, and available nurses, not policy or will. The legal framework from 1929 was now a clinical reality in 1944. The first stress test had been passed. The question was whether the system could scale. London and Paris, August through November 1944. A Provost Marshal General circular moved through headquarters channels, bearing the stamp medical action and routing instructions to theater medical commands and to camp surgeons in the zone of interior. The continental United States. Prisoner rumor mills had predicted punitive withholding of care. The directive enforced infirmaries, isolation wards for communicable diseases, and regular medical inspections per the Geneva Convention. The Provost Marshal General's Office administered custody. The Surgeon General's Office set medical policy. Supreme Headquarters Allied Expeditionary Force Civil Affairs coordinated compliance. The International Committee of the Red Cross conducted inspections and filed reports. These institutions operated in parallel, each with defined authority. In the zone of interior, the United States held approximately 425,000 German prisoners of war across roughly 700 camps by the war's end. Camp infirmaries operated under United States medical oversight. Army Nurse Corps members and civilian contract nurses staffed these facilities. The scale was enormous. The procedures were standardized. Article 14 of the 1929 Convention was explicit. Every camp shall have an infirmary where prisoners of war may receive every kind of attention they may require. The detaining power was obligated to provide not merely minimal care, but care equivalent to that given its own forces. United States doctrine exceeded the minimum. Infirmaries were equipped, medical officers were assigned, nurses rotated through camp hospitals as through any military medical facility. Security and medical authority produced an inspectable system. Provost marshal offices tracked prisoner movements and guard assignments. Army Medical Department commands tracked admissions, treatments, surgical procedures, and pharmaceutical inventories. When International Committee of the Red Cross delegates arrived for inspections, they reviewed records, toured wards, and interviewed patients. Their reports, filed in Geneva and Washington, cited compliance or noted deficiencies. Deficiencies, when noted, generated corrective action orders. The feedback loop functioned. The system was not sentiment. It was administration. Camp surgeons submitted monthly reports listing patient admissions by diagnosis, treatments rendered, pharmaceuticals dispensed, and outcomes. Nationality appeared in census data, but did not alter clinical protocols. A fractured femur required traction, immobilization, and nursing observation, whether the patient was American or German. Pneumonia required sulfur drugs or penicillin, oxygen if available, and monitoring for respiratory distress. Appendicitis required surgery within hours. Inspectors verified compliance, theater reports and zone of interior summaries documented throughput. The real constraints were beds and available nurses, not rules or reluctance. By late 1944, the infrastructure was in place and functioning at scale. Policy had met practice. The legal framework from 1929 was now embedded in daily operations across 2 continents. The question was no longer whether the system could function, but whether it could sustain itself under the pressures ahead. European Theatre of Operations, August through October 1944. A ward roster listed morning assignments: 2 bays for United States wounded, 1 bay for German prisoners. The nurse-to-bed ratio was identical. Rounds followed the same schedule. Medication administration, wound dressing changes, temperature and pulse recordings all occurred on the same timeline. Theatre planners had feared staff collapse. The Army Nurse Corps had grown, but would the expansion keep pace with casualties and the unexpected burden of prisoner care? The answer lay in numbers and rotations. By 1945, the Army Nurse Corps had approximately 59,000 members on duty. Evacuation hospitals expanded bed capacity in theater. Admissions were tracked per 100 beds per month. Surgical wards and medical wards calculated nurse-to-patient ratios that epidemiological studies would later correlate with mortality and length of stay. Colonel Florence A. Blanchfield, as Superintendent of the Army Nurse Corps, oversaw assignments and rotations. Theatre nursing administrators adjusted shift schedules to match admission surges. Hospital commanders balanced surgical backlogs against available operating room time and post-operative nursing capacity. The system flexed, but it did not break. Standardized surgical sets ensured consistency. Each set contained scalpels, clamps, retractors, sutures, and dressings in predetermined quantities. Penicillin dosing followed theatre protocols: initial loading dose, maintenance schedule, charting of response. Whole blood logistics matured. Mobile blood banks collected, typed, cross-matched, and delivered blood to forward hospitals. Night shift observation charts tracked shock indicators: falling blood pressure, rapid pulse, decreased urine output, cold extremities. An Army Nurse Corps circular, excerpted in medical archives, stated the operational principle: care will be rendered without distinction, record nationality only in administrative blocks. The instruction was procedural, not philosophical. Charts included a field for nationality to satisfy administrative and legal documentation requirements. That field did not alter prescriptions, frequencies of observation, or nursing interventions. Adequate nurse staffing and standardized equipment kits produced bedside parity that was reproducible across units. Where nurse-to-patient ratios held within doctrine, post-operative mortality rates converged between United States and prisoner patients. The correlation was documented in theater medical summaries and later analyzed in official medical histories. Survival depended on timely surgery, availability of blood products, prevention of shock, and skilled post-operative nursing. Nationality was statistically irrelevant. The manpower surge had succeeded. The Army Nurse Corps scaled to meet the burden of 2 armies, its own and its enemies. The lesson was clear: doctrine and logistics, properly resourced, could extend humane treatment at unprecedented scale. The infrastructure was holding. The question now was whether procedures learned in one theater could transfer to another. Sicily and Italy, 1943 to Normandy, 1944. An Italian theater surgery log recorded time intervals from wounding to definitive surgery. These targets, documented, tested, and proven in the Mediterranean, would be copied into European theater of operations procedures a year later. The lesson had been learned in one theater, it would be applied in the next. Early in the war, battlefield medicine improvised. Aid stations were understaffed, evacuation was slow, definitive surgery was delayed by hours or days, infection rates were high, mortality from septic complications was predictable and grim. 5th Army Medical Services and liaison officers from 8th Army learned through trial, error, and meticulous record-keeping. The breakthrough was time: wounding to aid station, minutes mattered; aid station to operating tent, hours determined. Outcome: operating tent to evacuation hospital, days decided recovery or relapse. Theater surgeons documented these intervals and correlated them with infection rates, reoperation rates, and mortality. The data was undeniable. Definitive surgery within 6 to 8 hours reduced septic complications by half. A theater circular from the Mediterranean campaign, preserved in official medical histories, codified the finding: definitive surgery within 6 to 8 hours reduces septic complications by half. The statement was not aspiration, it was instruction. Commanders adjusted evacuation schedules. Ambulance companies ran tighter routes. Mobile surgical units leapfrogged forward with advancing troops. The whole blood program, initially experimental, became standard. Refrigerated blood moved by jeep, truck, and aircraft. Thiopental sodium and ether became the anesthesia protocol of choice. Rapid induction, stable maintenance, quick emergence. Shock control protocols matured. Plasma first to restore volume. Whole blood second to restore oxygen carrying capacity. Warmth to prevent hypothermia. Monitoring to detect deterioration. These steps, in that order, became doctrine. When 1st United States Army landed in Normandy in June of 1944, the procedures traveled with it. Mediterranean veterans staffed key medical command positions. The lessons learned in Sicily and Italy were now standing operating procedures in France. The timings applied to all casualties, American, British, and German. Process discipline, not nationality, drove infection curves downward. By late 1944, the system was self-correcting. When evacuation times slipped, infection rates rose. When surgical backlogs accumulated, mortality increased. Commanders read the reports and adjusted resources. The lesson from the Mediterranean had been institutionalized. Proven methods became repeatable protocols. The result was measurable. Fewer infections, shorter hospital stays, better survival. The infrastructure was not perfect. Surges overwhelmed hospitals. Supply lines stretched. Weather delayed evacuations. But the doctrine held. The principles tested in Italy were now standard in France. And because the principles applied universally, they applied to prisoners as well. The same timings saved German lives that saved American lives. Discipline, not charity, produced the outcome. Bayeux to Carentan, France, June through July 1944. A Signal Corps photographer captured the moment. A German prisoner on a litter, conscious, eyes wide, being carried into a United States evacuation hospital. The caption was factual. The image documented a process that many German soldiers had not believed possible. Prisoners expected denial. Propaganda had conditioned them to anticipate punitive treatment, withheld surgery, minimal care. Hospital records show otherwise. Post-operative orders in patient charts were identical regardless of nationality. A wound, SHAEF, required debridement, irrigation, and closure or packing. A compound fracture required reduction, immobilization, and observation for vascular compromise. A perforated bowel required laparotomy, resection or repair, and peritoneal drainage. The procedures did not vary. Evacuation hospitals attached to 1st United States Army processed daily intakes. Military police companies provided guards. German medical orderlies, screened by United States medical officers, assisted with non-clinical tasks under supervision. The division of labor was clear. Americans retained responsibility for medications, charting, and clinical decisions. German orderlies handled bed baths, linen changes, and meal service under direct oversight. Daily prisoner intake logs recorded admission diagnoses, surgical procedures performed, antibiotic courses initiated, and average length of stay before rear evacuation. The numbers were precise. Penicillin schedules specified dose, frequency, route, and duration. Dressings were changed on a set timeline. Immobilization was maintained per orthopedic protocol. Diet scales matched clinical need, liquid for post-operative gastrointestinal cases, soft for maxillofacial wounds, regular for convalescents. A ward order, preserved in medical archives, made the standard explicit. Nationality shall not modify nursing frequency, analgesia, or diet scale. The instruction was operational. Nurses made rounds on schedule. Pain medication was administered per standing orders or as needed. Dietary requests within medical limits were honored. Custody procedures, guard posts, movement restrictions, interview protocols ran parallel to clinical care but did not intersect it. Military police separated functions. Guards controlled prisoner movement. Medical staff controlled treatment. When a German patient required X-ray, a guard accompanied him to the radiology section and waited outside. When surgery was needed, a guard stood outside the operating room. When wounds were dressed, a guard remained at the ward entrance. Security and medicine operated in parallel, not in conflict. In matched cases, similar wounds, similar physiology, similar timing from injury to treatment, order sets were line for line identical. Charts from United States patients and German prisoners showed the same medication names, the same dosing intervals, the same nursing observations. The evidence was written, dated, and signed. It was not sentiment, it was documentation. The system worked because it was a system. Clear orders, adequate staffing, and separated functions produced clinical neutrality at scale. The surprise recorded in prisoner memoirs and interrogation summaries was not that care existed, but that it was methodical, professional, and rule-driven. The expectation had been chaos. The reality was procedure. Zone of Interior, October through December 1944. A camp infirmary log open to a routine entry, measles isolation for a German. Prisoner work detachment. The notation included bed assignments, quarantine duration, vaccination status of contacts, and follow-up schedule. The entry was mundane, its existence was significant. Epidemic fears haunted camp administrators. Crowded barracks, shared latrines, large work details, all created conditions for rapid disease spread. Preventive medicine doctrine and inspection leverage kept outbreaks contained. Camp surgeons operated under Army Medical Department standards. Army Nurse Corps members or civilian contract nurses staffed infirmaries. International Committee of the Red Cross delegates conducted periodic inspections. German medical orderlies worked under United States supervision. Vaccination counts were tracked. Isolation bed capacities were calculated. Convalescent transfers were logged. The scale was formidable. By war's end, the United States held approximately 425,000 German prisoners across roughly 700 camps. Each camp required an infirmary. Each infirmary required staff, supplies, and oversight. Quarantine procedures followed public health doctrine. A suspected case triggered isolation, contact tracing, and observation. Water supplies were tested monthly. Latrine standards specified construction, maintenance, and chlorination schedules. Dental clinics operated in larger camps. X-ray screening for tuberculosis was routine. The procedures were neither punitive nor lenient. They were preventive. A camp surgeon's monthly report, excerpted in Texas State Historical Association archives, summarized operations. Infirmary operated within table of organization and equipment. No variance in drug issue by nationality. The language was bureaucratic. The meaning was operational. Pharmaceutical inventories were issued per medical need, not per prisoner status. Sulfur drugs, aspirin, antiseptics, bandages, all distributed according to clinical indication. Inspections provided accountability. International Committee of the Red Cross delegates arrived unannounced, toured infirmaries, reviewed patient charts, and interviewed prisoners. Their reports noted deficiencies, insufficient blankets, delayed X-rays, understaffed isolation wards. Deficiencies generated corrective action orders. Follow-up inspections verified compliance. The loop closed within weeks. The system was not flawless. Some camps were better staffed than others. Some regions faced supply shortages. Some infirmaries operated above planned capacity. But the structure held. Preventive systems and inspection leverage produced sustained compliance despite camp growth and prisoner transfers. Inspection files tell a consistent story. Deficiencies appear, corrections follow. A January report notes inadequate heating in an infirmary. February records installation of additional stoves. March confirms temperature compliance. An April report cites delayed dental care. May documents arrival of a contract dentist. June shows treatment backlog cleared. The files are repetitive, detailed, and dull. They are also evidence. The mundane nature of the records is the point. Camp medicine was not drama. It was administration, routine, documented, inspectable. The infrastructure operated month after month, processing tens of thousands of prisoners through infirmaries, isolation wards, and convalescent sections. The same forms, the same standards, the same inspections. The system sustained itself not through sentiment, but through procedure. Ardennes region and rear European theater areas, December 1944 through January 1945. Snow-wet litters entered a shock ward already operating above planned capacity. A nurse updated the penicillin administration board, adding new names to a list that already exceeded the ward's design load. Among the names were German prisoners. The clinical orders did not change. The German offensive through the Ardennes created a surge. Daily admission counts spiked. Bed occupancy rose above thresholds. Surgical backlogs accumulated. Penicillin inventories tightened. Hospital trains ran continuously. Ambulance companies moved patients rearward to create space for new arrivals. Theater medical commands coordinated overflow redistribution. The system was under strain. Commanders expected collapse. The fear was rational. If resources became scarce, would prisoner care be sacrificed? Theater directives answered clearly. A surge directive, preserved in medical archives, stated, "No deviation from clinical priority by status, adjust only guard detail and transport." Clinical priority remained based on medical urgency. Custody adjustments involved guard assignments and transportation sequencing, not treatment protocols. 1st and 3rd United States Army Medical Commands managed forward hospitals. Nursing supervisors coordinated bed assignments and surgical schedules. Ambulance companies shuttled patients between facilities. Hospital trains carried evacuation loads to rear areas and to ports for movement to the United Kingdom. The redistribution was continuous. Daily admission numbers climbed. Surgical case counts rose. Blood transfusion inventories were tracked hourly. Penicillin rationing policies prioritized severe infections and post-operative cases. Prisoners constituted a measurable percentage of total admissions, but that percentage did not alter allocation formulas. Antibiotics were distributed by medical indication. Wound infection, pneumonia, septicemia, not by nationality. Mobile surgical units displaced forward to relieve pressure. Bed capacities were increased by converting convalescent wards to acute care sections. Nursing shifts extended. Supply convoys prioritized medical cargo. The system bent under the load but maintained its structure. Mobility and inventory control absorbed the shock. Railroad networks, though disrupted by combat and weather, continued to move patients rearward. Ambulance routes adapted to changing front lines. Blood collection continued in rear areas and in the United Kingdom. Penicillin production in the United States ensured theater stocks, though distribution required constant management. International Committee of the Red Cross inspections continued even during the offensive. An inspection report from late December, cited in medical histories, recorded the finding: treatment satisfactory and in conformity with convention obligations despite current operational pressures. The notation was dry, the implication was significant. Under maximum strain, the policy held. Prisoners interviewed after evacuation to rear hospitals reported surprise. They had expected that wartime pressures would force abandonment or minimal care. Instead, they observed the same rounds, the same medications, the same surgical consultations they had seen in forward hospitals. The consistency was documented in their statements and in hospital records. The Ardennes surge tested whether doctrine could survive crisis. The answer was recorded in admission logs, surgical summaries, and inspection files. The system flexed, redistributed, and adapted. But it did not rewrite the rules. Even during the offensive, treatment remained a function of medical need, not military status. Rhineland to Ruhr region, Germany, March through April 1945. A transit hospital ledger listed patients awaiting surgical consultation: American, British, French, German. Nationality was noted. Surgical priority was determined by wound severity, time from injury, and physiological status. The round schedule, typed across the ledger's top margin, applied to all. German forces were collapsing. Mass surrenders occurred daily. Prisoner captures were measured in tens of thousands. Theater medical planners had feared that custody numbers would overwhelm hospital capacity. Instead, mobilization of mobile surgical teams and rapid setup of transit hospitals maintained the system. European theater chief surgeon forward elements coordinated hospital displacement. Mobile surgical hospitals moved with advancing units. Army Nurse Corps teams rotated to new sites every few days. The infrastructure was designed for mobility. Hospitals packed, moved, and reopened. Within 24 hours, operating rooms resumed function, wards accepted patients, the cycle repeated. Mobile operating rooms were self-contained units, surgical tables, anesthesia equipment, instrument sterilizers, lighting powered by portable generators, field sterilizers used steam under pressure. Anesthesia tables carried thiopental, ether, oxygen cylinders, and airway management tools. Supply lines maintained penicillin and whole blood pipelines, despite rapid forward movement and river crossings. A movement order, preserved in official records, specified the standard: hospital to be fully operational within 24 hours of arrival, prisoner of war ward locked, but on standard rounds. The instruction balanced security and medicine. Prisoner wards were guarded, doors were locked, movement was restricted, but nursing rounds, medication administration, and surgical consultations followed the same schedule as other wards. Daily prisoner captures strained transit capacities. Screening centers separated wounded from able-bodied. Wounded prisoners entered the medical evacuation chain. Able-bodied prisoners moved to rear enclosures. The sorting was rapid but methodical. Medical personnel made triage decisions. Provost marshal personnel handled custody. Transit hospital capacities expanded through modular additions. Tentage increased bed counts. Nurse detachments redeployed from rear hospitals to forward sites. Surgical teams worked extended hours. The system scaled by replicating standard modules, not by inventing new procedures. The Rhine crossings in March created logistical challenges. Bridges were contested. Ferries operated under fire. Yet medical supply lines maintained penicillin and blood delivery. Forward hospitals received pharmaceutical resupply within operational timelines. Blood moved by refrigerated truck and air transport. The pipelines held. Exploitation phases of operations stressed the system differently than defensive or static phases. Hospitals moved frequently, patient populations turned over rapidly, evacuations to rear areas accelerated. Yet the doctrine remained constant. Mobility did not erase procedure. Speed did not replace standards. The larger the custody footprint grew, the more visible the clinical neutrality became. Thousands of German prisoners passed through transit hospitals. Memoirs and interrogation summaries from this period record consistent observations, systematic triage, prompt surgery when indicated, post-operative care under guard, but without clinical differentiation. The scale made the policy unmistakable. Exploitation warfare tested whether mobile medicine could preserve treatment parity. The evidence suggests it could. Movement orders, hospital logs, and nursing reports from March and April 1945 document continuous operations under rapid displacement. The system moved, but it did not break. Unna, Germany, the 11th day of April, 1945. A Signal Corps photographer documented a moment that contradicted months of propaganda on both sides. A German nurse, in her own country, assisting a United States Army medic in treating a wounded German soldier. The photograph was filed. The caption was factual. The image was evidence. Prisoners expected humiliation. Instead, they encountered cooperation. German medical personnel, nurses, orderlies, physicians screened for political reliability, were employed under United States supervision in wards, treating German patients. The arrangement was pragmatic. It extended capacity without lowering standards. Local United States medical detachments supervised the integration. German nurses and orderlies were screened by intelligence officers and medical administrators. Political extremists were excluded. Competent medical personnel were retained. Army Nurse Corps section chiefs assigned tasks, supervised execution, and maintained accountability. Ward staffing tables documented the structure. United States nurses held leadership positions: section chief, surgical supervisor, night charge nurse. German auxiliaries performed delegated tasks: bed baths, wound dressings, meal service, linen changes. Restricted tasks, medication administration, charting, intravenous therapy, remained the responsibility of United States personnel. The division was clear. Delegation extended capacity. Supervision ensured standards. Infection control audits verified compliance. Patient-to-attendant ratios improved with the addition of auxiliary staff. But clinical accountability never transferred. A ward memo, excerpted in medical archives, formalized the policy. Enemy personnel may perform non-restricted duties under direct United States supervision. Accountability remains with Army Nurse Corps section. The language was administrative. The effect was operational. German personnel handled labor-intensive tasks. American personnel retained clinical authority. The arrangement benefited both sides. United States nurses managed more patients with the same staffing levels. German medical personnel continued professional practice under constrained circumstances. Wounded German soldiers received care from personnel who spoke their language and understood their cultural context, all under a framework that guaranteed standards. Cooperation on the ward floor contradicted propaganda narratives. German soldiers had been told that Americans were barbaric, that capture meant death or brutality. American soldiers had been told that all Germans were fanatical Nazis. The ward broke both stereotypes. Professional medical work proceeded. Orders were followed. Patients recovered or did not, based on wounds and physiology, not on ideology. The photograph from Unna became one of many. Signal Corps photographers documented medical operations throughout occupied Germany. Images show mixed staffing, guarded but cooperative wards, German and American personnel working side by side under clear command structures. The photographic record supports the written record. Integration of enemy caregivers was not universal. It occurred where local conditions allowed, where screened personnel were available, where United States supervisors could maintain oversight, but where it occurred, it was documented, photographed, and reported. The policy was neither secret nor apologetic. It was practical medical administration under occupation. The unexpected outcome was not that enemies cooperated, but that procedure allowed cooperation. Clear task definitions, maintained supervision, and accountability structures enabled pragmatic solutions. The propaganda on both sides had predicted irreconcilable hatred. The ward logs recorded mundane collaboration under military discipline. Supreme Headquarters, Allied Expeditionary Force Forward, Germany, April through May, 1945. An Eclipse Planning Annex outlined medical handling for the war's end. Triage streams for surrendered German forces, care for displaced persons, and repatriation screening for Allied ex-prisoners of war. The planning was comprehensive. The hostilities had not yet ended, but the procedures for managing surrender were already written. Theater planners had feared that German surrender would overwhelm hospitals. Millions of prisoners, tens of thousands wounded, uncounted displaced persons. The medical burden appeared insurmountable. Pre-written triage streams and designated repatriation hospitals provided the framework. Supreme Headquarters, Allied Expeditionary Force Medical Division, coordinated with Civil Affairs and International Committee of the Red Cross liaison staff. Bed allocations for occupation were calculated. Evacuation hospitals scheduled for closure or conversion were identified. Repatriation hospitals were designated. Transport medical clearance procedures were standardized. Surrendered German forces included wounded requiring ongoing care. Displaced persons included malnourished and diseased populations. Allied ex-prisoners required medical screening before repatriation. Each population required different procedures, but all required medical resources. Nutritional rehabilitation standards specified calorie scales for refeeding severely malnourished individuals. Infectious disease screening protocols identified tuberculosis, typhus, and other communicable diseases. Transportation medical clearance ensured that evacuees could survive transit. The procedures were clinical, not punitive. An eclipse extract, preserved in Eisenhower Library collections, stated the continuing obligation. Medical responsibility continues until transfer of custody to designated authority. No alteration in clinical priority authorized. The planning document anticipated the end of hostilities, but did not anticipate a change in medical policy. Treatment remained a function of need. Movement remained a function of planning. Bed allocations reflected anticipated loads. Occupation forces required fewer hospitals than combat operations, but repatriation screening and displaced person care required sustained capacity. Theater medical planners calculated bed days per 1,000 population, surgical capacity requirements, and pharmaceutical inventories for transition operations. Scheduled drawdown of evacuation hospitals proceeded in phases. Hospitals in forward areas closed or converted to transit functions. Rear area hospitals absorbed longer-term patients. General hospitals in the United Kingdom and the Zone of Interior prepared for repatriation cases. The sequence was scripted. Medically cleared prisoners moved to labor companies or repatriation centers. Those requiring continued hospitalization remained under medical hold. The distinction was administrative. A compound fracture in traction could not be transported. A surgical wound requiring dressing changes could not be released. Medical criteria determined retention or release, not policy preference. Planning doctrine enabled orderly transition from combat medicine to occupation public health. The shift was significant. Combat medicine prioritized trauma and acute surgical care. Occupation public health emphasized infectious disease control, nutritional rehabilitation, and sanitation. The infrastructure adapted because the planning anticipated the transition. The Eclipse annexes covered not only procedures but also reporting. Medical officers were instructed to maintain census data, track admissions by diagnosis, report pharmaceutical consumption, and document transfers. The data would feed into occupation administration and historical analysis. Accountability continued through the transition. With hostilities ending in May 1945, the policy did not change. Theater hospitals continued to treat by need and move by plan. The consistency was documented in daily reports, hospital logs, and civil affairs summaries. Surrender altered the volume and composition of patients. It did not alter the medical standard. The planning had been prudent. The execution would prove the planning correct. The end game was not chaos. It was procedure, written in advance, executed on schedule. The surprise was not that the war ended, but that the medical system anticipated the end and prepared accordingly. Germany and the Zone of Interior United States. May through December 1945. A camp hospital morning report listed convalescent prisoners on light duty, medically cleared for transport, awaiting movement orders. The war in Europe had ended. Medical administration continued. Theater commanders anticipated attrition after victory. The expectation was understandable. With combat over, would standards slip? Inspection files suggest otherwise. International Committee of the Red Cross delegates continued periodic visits. Reports noted sustained compliance with convention obligations as prisoners were processed for labor assignments or repatriation. United States Army medical detachments in occupied Germany operated under the same doctrine that had governed wartime operations. Army Nurse Corps supervisors maintained ward schedules. German medical auxiliaries, retained under supervision, continued delegated tasks. The structure persisted through the transition. Hundreds of thousands of prisoners were medically processed for repatriation or labor service. In the Zone of Interior, United States custody remained at approximately 425,000 German prisoners across roughly 700 camps. Stepwise returns to Europe began in stages, with medical screening preceding each movement. Calorie scales ensured adequate nutrition for prisoners awaiting repatriation. Tuberculosis screening identified cases requiring isolation or treatment before transport. Dental rehabilitation addressed long-deferred dental disease. Surgical follow-up tracked healing of wartime wounds. The medical processing was thorough. Movement to ports followed medical clearance. Prisoners with active infections, unhealed wounds, or unstable medical conditions remained on medical hold. Those cleared for transport moved by rail to embarkation points. Medical officers accompanied transports. Shipboard medical detachments staffed transatlantic voyages. An International Committee of the Red Cross inspection note from summer 1945, cited in official histories, summarized conditions, hospital wards adequate, treatment observed without distinction of nationality. The language was familiar. The notation confirmed continuity. Post-hostility operations maintained pre-hostility standards. Administrative continuity and sustained nursing manpower enabled humane drawdown. The Army Nurse Corps began demobilization in phases, but staffing levels remained adequate for mission requirements. Camp hospitals, occupation hospitals, and repatriation hospitals operated with sufficient personnel through 1946. The same forms and the same rounds that had sustained the system during combat now closed the war. Morning reports, surgical logs, pharmaceutical inventories, admission and discharge summaries all continued in familiar format. The bureaucracy was tedious. It was also evidence. German prisoners repatriated to Europe carried medical records documenting care received. These records became part of post-war historical analysis. Some former prisoners published memoirs, some were interviewed by historians. The accounts were not uniform, but consistent themes emerged: systematic processing, rule-based treatment, professional conduct by medical and nursing staff. The surprise recorded in these accounts was not that the United States treated prisoners humanely, but that the humanity was procedural rather than sentimental. It was encoded in standing orders, verified by inspections, and documented in records. The system was neither cruel nor kind. It was methodical. Post-victory operations demonstrated that the medical framework was durable. It functioned in combat. It functioned in occupation. It functioned during repatriation. The consistency suggested that the system was what its architects claimed: a rule-based, resource-supported application of international law and military medical doctrine. United States and Europe, 1942 through 1946, summary. A compiled statistical table documented the system's scale: Army Nurse Corps strength at war's end, prisoner camp counts, European theater admissions, post-operative mortality trends, and International Committee of the Red Cross inspection compliance percentages. The numbers told a story that predictions of retaliation or neglect had not anticipated. Predictions made early in the war assumed that prisoners would face punitive withholding of care or, at minimum, treatment inferior to that provided to United States forces. The statistical record contradicted those predictions. The alignment was not perfect, but it was measurable and documented. The Surgeon General's office compiled post-war medical histories. The Army Nurse Corps published strength reports. Supreme Headquarters Allied Expeditionary Force Medical Division archived theater summaries. The Provost Marshal General's office tallied custody numbers. The International Committee of the Red Cross filed inspection reports. These records, cross-referenced, produced a comprehensive picture. Army Nurse Corps strength peaked near 59,000 members. The expansion was deliberate and sustained. In January 1945, manpower shortages were severe enough to prompt consideration of near-draft legislation. The expansion reflected not sentiment, but calculated need. American casualties, Allied casualties, and prisoner casualties all required nursing care under the doctrinal framework. The Zone of Interior operated roughly 700 camps, holding approximately 425,000 German prisoners at peak. Each camp maintained an infirmary. Each infirmary required medical officers, nurses, orderlies, pharmaceuticals, and equipment. The logistical burden was enormous. The system functioned. European theater admissions totaled hundreds of thousands. Exact prisoner admission figures varied by source, but theater medical summaries documented steady prisoner intake from Normandy onward. Evacuation hospitals processed mixed patient populations throughout the campaign. The proportion of prisoner patients increased during exploitation phases when German surrenders accelerated. Inspection files provided compliance data. International Committee of the Red Cross reports cited deficiencies and corrective actions, but overall compliance with convention obligations was documented repeatedly. Reports used phrases such as treatment in conformity with convention and medical attention satisfactory. The language was bureaucratic, but the meaning was clear. Doctrine translated to outcomes: triage by medical urgency, timely surgery, blood product availability, antibiotic administration, and post-operative nursing all correlated with survival. These factors applied regardless of nationality. Statistical analyses conducted in post-war medical studies confirmed that survival depended on medical variables, not on patient status. A Surgeon General post-war summary excerpted in official medical histories stated the principle plainly. Treatment was given according to medical need. Nationality did not alter the indication. The statement was descriptive, not prescriptive. It summarized what the records showed. The law had been written in 1929. The doctrine had been codified in the years before the war. The staffing had expanded between 1942 and 1945. The infrastructure had deployed across 2 theaters and the Zone of Interior. The inspections had verified compliance. The statistical record documented outcomes. By 1945, parity of care was not sentiment. It was an auditable system staffed by tens of thousands of United States Army nurses. The significance lay not in exceptional heroism or extraordinary compassion, but in systematic application of legal obligations through adequate resources and professional discipline. German prisoners encountered treatment many of them had not expected because the United States had built a medical system scaled to provide it. The numbers measured what the doctrine promised. The inspections verified what the numbers measured. The archives preserved what the inspections verified. And in that preservation, the record stood. International law, applied through logistics and manpower, produced outcomes that distinguished capability from sentiment. This was the reality documented in the files. This was the system that operated from Normandy to occupation. This was what made policy into measurable practice. This documentary narrative follows the written record, the Geneva Convention of 1929, United States Army Medical Doctrine, Army Nurse Corps Manpower Expansion, Provost Marshal Custody Procedures, Supreme Headquarters Allied Expeditionary Force Planning Documents, International Committee of the Red Cross Inspection Files, and Theater Hospital Operational Histories. It explains why German prisoners of war encountered standardized, humane medical treatment at scale during 1944 and 45. The answer lies not in sentiment, but in systems, legal frameworks adopted years before the war, medical doctrine matured through peacetime planning and wartime experience. Nursing manpower expanded nearly ninefold, inspection regimes that provided accountability and logistical capacity that sustained operations across 2 continents. The surprise recorded in prisoner accounts and inspection reports was not that individual Americans showed kindness, but that the kindness was systematic, procedural, and verifiable. German soldiers expected chaos or cruelty. They encountered bureaucracy and protocol. That protocol, properly resourced and professionally executed, produced outcomes that international law required and that military doctrine enabled. The camps, the hospitals, the evacuation chains, the mobile surgical units, the repatriation centers, all operated within a framework that balanced security and medicine, custody and care. The guards and the nurses performed separate functions under separate authorities toward a common end: lawful detention and treaty-compliant treatment. If you value fact-based military history built on primary sources, archival documents, official statistics, inspection reports, and unit operational records, this channel offers that approach. The stories told here rely on what can be documented, measured, and verified. The past deserves accuracy. The participants deserve respect. The record deserves preservation.